The Eastern Front on the Russia-Ukraine war is in the possibly the early phases of an actual collapse. Things are starting to fall apart at an increasing rate in the east. The Russian army is making larger and larger advances to the west, and the Ukraine is having a hard time even maintaining their positions, much less to stop the Russian onslaught. Meanwhile, in the northern part of the country, the Ukrainians continue to be stuck in their incursion in the Kursk region. Their forward momentum has effectively stopped, and it's not clear how much longer they can stay there. In the midst of all of this, we have a public statement by President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, who says he's going to come next month to Washington to visit with President Joe Biden to give him the victory plan over Russia. So that is by itself a big eye opener and a head scratcher. And we're going to get into all why that is with Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, combat veteran and highly decorated, who's himself been in tank battles before. So there's nobody better to talk about these things today and bring some reality into the situation desperately needed. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Well, listen, we'll just jump right into this one because there's no sugarcoating this. This is going to be hard for you to watch. It was hard for us to put together, and I can only imagine how you're going to respond to some of this if you haven't seen it. But wow, I feel kind of bad for a lot of the Western public who only sees the some of the clips that we're about to pop up there without the context and without the analysis that we're going to be asking you to provide here in a second, because some of these things are just incredibly detached from reality, even more so than some of the things we've been talking about earlier in this war. And if you think I'm exaggerating, first of all, let's start off with Zelensky himself. This is what he had to say yesterday at a press conference.
Курщина, як я вам сказав, входить в наш план перемоги України. Може, це звучить для когось амбітно, але план – це для нас дуже важливий план. Я деякі речі, напевно, щось можу сказати, не впевнений, що все. Один із напрямків, де частина якого вже зроблена, це Курщина. А другий напрямок – це стратегічне місце України в безпековій інфраструктурі світу. Третій напрямок – це пакет примусу, потужний пакет примусу Росії до закінчення війни дипломатичним шляхом. І четвертий напрямок економічний, про все це детально говорити не буду. План підготовлений. Думаю, справедливо, якщо я цей план представлю спочатку президенту Сполучених Штатів, від нього залежить успіх цього плану.
Okay, so I want to put just a wee bit of context on his point 3 of his basically 5 points there before we get your comment. He says he's going to have a powerful new package to force Russia into a negotiated settlement. And this is after they spent somewhere between 6 to 9 months preparing an offensive in 2023, which was utterly crushed and had its teeth broken on the first of 5 defensive lines by the Russian side there. And now then, after all of that, he comes out with this plan. Doug, what do you say when you hear him say he's going to force Russia to negotiate?
Well, frankly, if he's planning on a trip to Washington, you said next month, it might be a one-way trip because he may not be able to go back. That's how bad things are in Ukraine. And I cannot conceive of any means of turning this around. Certainly not with any particular weapon system. And the armed forces themselves are decimated. It's pure fantasy, once again, for the consumption of people in the West.
And would you, especially because he's saying that his point 1 was that the Kursk operation, this incursion, this bulge, if you'll forgive the analogy there, where he pushed up into the Russian side there, he said that was part of his plan. That's what he's trying to use to force Russia into negotiated settlement. On the first point, let's just look at the Russian side of this. What do you think, from all the history that you understand about Russia, that they're going to take a single, even partial tactical setback, and it's going to have strategic implications that they're just going to say, all right, we'll go ahead and negotiate with you? When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has spoken on this topic, and we need to take him seriously. He's been in the job for 20 years, and he is in the grand tradition of other former Russian foreign ministers like Nesselrode and Gorshakov in the 19th century. He understands his own people, his own state. He understands what President Putin is trying to achieve, and he's made it abundantly clear the period of negotiation is at an end. There's no longer any willingness to do that. So I think the Russians are now on a path to what I would call final resolution of the conflict. Not sure what that looks like, but I certainly think it looks like Ukraine without Zelensky and the regime in Kiev.
Now, for the benefit of those who may not have seen, I'm going to real quick hit, whoa, wrong button. I'm going to pull up the map of this incursion, because we keep talking about the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. You can see this here. This is the main line of contact, which has been going on for 2+ years. And then up in here is the area of the Kursk. Now, this, I want you to just real quick from a military perspective, when you see this incursion here, and I think the farthest point is like 35 kilometers, I think. The whole area there is relatively wide, but only relatively, because then here's what it looks like just even in the Kursk region. It's barely I think 3% is what I saw, which is only a tiny part of the Russian Federation. So what is the chance militarily that somewhere between 12 to 15,000 Ukrainian troops can even hold this area, much less continue to go forward within Russia?
Zero. And first of all, keep in mind that this area is huge. You're talking about adding Nebraska or something in that whole brown area to what is the size of Texas and Ukraine. So you're adding a lot of territory, but that territory is densely forested. Rivers, creeks, hills, very difficult terrain. There aren't very many people living there to begin with. The few villages that were there have been evacuated, largely because the Russians wanted to encourage the Ukrainians to go into these villages and then turn them into what the Russians call fire pockets. Invite them in, then annihilate them with fire. Right now, roughly less than half of the forces that went in to begin with are still alive. They can't get out. How many are killed versus wounded, who knows? But at least 7,000 to 8,000 of the original number are killed or wounded. They have no tanks, no mobility, no artillery to speak of. They have been subjected to systematic annihilation from almost within the first 24 hours. Right now, you have along the original route that they took pockets of, say, 3,000 or 4,000 Ukrainian and allied U.S., U.K., Polish troops, essentially in a what we used to call a die-in-place position. They can't surrender. If they surrender, certainly the Americans and the British and the Poles are going to be in a lot of trouble. So I doubt seriously there's any willingness on their part to give up. The Ukrainians might, but even then, they no longer can count on the kindness and generosity that they've been shown in the past. People say, well, that's never been the case. That's not true. The Russians could have been a lot harder on the Ukrainians from the beginning than they've ever been. Now I think the gloves are coming off, and that's what the population in Russia wants. So this entire Kursk business should not be compared to the Bulge, because frankly, the Bulge was a high risk, gamble for Hitler at the time, but it was more plausible than anything you see here. And ultimately, the Bulge failed because the Germans didn't have enough fuel to power their way forward, not because they were systematically defeated on the ground. They were not. And ultimately, most of the equipment we found after the Bulge was over had not been damaged by air power. Some of it was destroyed by artillery, but a lot of it was just left intact or demolished on site. So my point is, this was pure folly, fantasy, and stupidity from the day it began. Now Zelensky has nothing left but hot air, and I think you're being subjected to a lot of hot air.
Well, if we were going to power some balloons, we would have plenty of fuel for that. But it's not just limited to the Ukrainians. You might be willing to forgive them for trying to put a good face on something that's really bad. though I think that there's a lot of room for genuine criticism, significant criticism of why anyone ever thought that this would have any kind of a chance. To your point there, the bulge actually had as an objective for the Germans to take Antwerp and potentially split the forces, whatever. And so it wasn't a whole lot of chance, but if they had succeeded, it could have made a big difference, at least operationally, for a while. Here, there was no tactical objective that even held the possibility of changing any of the operational terms of the battle between the Russian side and the Ukraine side.
Well,
But
I still think that they were trying to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. I think that was real. They wanted to do that. Now, why they thought that was worth the loss, worth the cost, is beyond my imagination. But I think there was also something sinister involved with it. And that is, if they couldn't capture it, perhaps they could get close enough to demolish it, do damage, and cause a nuclear accident of some kind. I mean, these people have reached the point of desperation. And that's the thing I think that the Russians are now most concerned about. Desperation in Kiev and, frankly, desperation in Washington.
yeah, and as we'll see at other capitals as well. As a matter of fact, here is what's billed as an expert on France 24 earlier, talking about this situation and what Ukraine hoped to accomplish and what Zelensky's victory plan might look like. Watch this.
Many are saying, well, you should pull the troops out of Russia and send them into eastern Ukraine. I think what the Ukrainians are looking at here is trying to twist the arm of Vladimir Putin, trying to put him in a difficult position, not only with his generals and his advisors in Moscow, because he's seen as the strong man of Russia, the only one able to defend Russia. This is the largest incursion into Russian territory since the Second World War, and it's going to fragilize the position of Vladimir Putin.
So I just couldn't believe I hear that it's going to fragilize Putin. After 2.5 years of war, after 20 years in office, he's going to be fragilized over this very small incursion. What do you make of that?
I'm unfamiliar with the verb fragilize. I don't think that exists. This gentleman should go back to calling Chelsea versus Manchester football matches. He's out of touch with reality. He's simply repeating stupidity. All of this is propping up the rapidly crumbling picture of Ukraine and this entire war. Just dismiss this nonsense out of hand.
Okay, and now then we're going to go to another one that again. Okay, I've had Jack Keane on a lot. We've talked about him on a number of the shows that you've been on here, and a lot of the stuff that he says is just kind of nonsensical. But in my view, this is a new low, and this is shocking to me to listen to what he lays out as alleged logic points here. Just watch this.
What the Ukrainians want to do is punish Russia as much as possible, take as much territory as they possibly can, prevent Russia from taking more territory in the Donbass region, and go into negotiations next year in the best possible position. And as long as the administration keeps stalling and protracting the war, and that's what restricting the use of U.S. weapons in the Ukrainians' hands is actually doing, slowing down Ukrainians' efforts to be able to gain leverage over the Russians, makes no sense militarily, makes no sense politically.
Okay, let's talk about that. What makes sense militarily? I want to look at those things in order. So one of the first things he said was the objective of the Ukraine side was to seize as much land as they can in order to force Putin to negotiate. But when militarily is merely holding on to a piece of terrain, tactically useful?
In that part of the world, not much. One of the advantages the Russians have had over the rest of us over many, many years was their recognition that ground in and of itself is meaningless. Ground is only important insofar as it provides the force with an advantage, either in defense or offense. In other words, giving up ground for a better position in a way that helps you destroy your attacking enemy is something the Russians have learned, and they do it quite well. I think Jack Keane is simply divorced from reality. Now, there's something else going on here that needs to be kept in mind. There has never been any viable strategy for this proxy war in Ukraine. The objectives were never clear because they didn't make any sense and they were meaningless. The objectives were harm Russia, degrade Russia. We've been hearing this over and over and over again. Now, march into Russia and grab ground. You know, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. It never did. The problem is, and this is what the Russians, I think, are worried about, when you have no strategy to begin with, and if you have no strategy, inevitably you end up at a place called Stalingrad. That's kind of the lesson of war. But we have no strategy, and their worry is that as it becomes increasingly obvious that the whole thing is falling apart, that as a compensation for no strategy, we turn to the nuclear threat, which is why you've had these inferred or implied statements about the use of nuclear weapons and playing with nuclear fire. The Russians have made it quite clear they will not use these weapons unless we use them first. Although recently, if you listen to Lavrov's remarks, there's the indication that they may be willing to preempt if they see unambiguous, concrete evidence that we are primed and ready to shoot at them with nuclear weapons. In other words, if we begin to do things with nuclear munitions at sea, in the air, on the ground, wherever we are in the European theater, or for that matter, back in the United States, if we're going to equip bombers, B-2s, for instance, for long-range strikes, they're going to look at that very carefully. And if they think we're actually going to do the unthinkable, which is use a nuclear weapon, then they're telling us we're not going to sit quietly and let you nuke us. We may preempt it. Now, he didn't come out and say it, but you have to read the words very, very carefully. And this is what happens when there is no strategy. Nuclear weapons were welcomed into the inventory back in the 50s and the 60s because they said, see, no need for strategy anymore. You attack us, we annihilate you. Well, all of that went away when effectively the nuclear powers in the world achieved parity. Now, some people will say, well, we've got more than China. China has less than us. Russia has more than us, but we have better this. Listen, when you have an inventory of thousands of nuclear weapons, whether they are just warheads or rockets, and you have the delivery systems to deliver any of them, you're courting Armageddon. And when you reach that point, you must have a strategy, because if you don't, you end up in a corner, and that's where we are. Zelensky's in a corner, and we're in that corner too. We're just not on site. We're sitting several thousand miles away, feeling a degree of security which is not justified. And that's another message that Lavrov had. You know, if you think you can sit back unmolested, this will cost you nothing. You're wrong. And that means a lot of different things. If you want to talk about them, I think we should, because I don't think the American people are really paying attention to this.
Right. Yeah. I did see that one of the things about Lavrov yesterday, where he expressly stated, if you think you're secure by your oceans on your left and right, get over that comfort, because it's definitely not true. So he unambiguously, that was one of the things he was very direct and explicit about. The other part about changing our nuclear doctrine, he left ambiguous, I think, for a good reason. One last thing I want to talk about that Keene was talking about here, because I think it's really important, because he's saying something that a lot of others are saying, was that, you know, what the administration should do is take off all the constraints and let Ukraine fire whatever they want into anywhere they want in Russia, and that's going to have an impact. Now, I know your view on what that's going to do, or what it might do, but I want to, first of all, if you could speak to the military, even the potential military utility of, could that actually cause Russia to lose the war or lose its ability to offensively operate in Ukraine?
Well, the answer to the second question, the possibility of Russian loss is non-existent. And the idea that they would be deprived of offensive power in the event that they decide to exploit it, that's ridiculous. I think there are two things here. First, you can go back, and I'm sure all of your audience remembers this. I think I heard President Biden and others in the Defense Department and the State Department say, we will never provide modern strike missiles. We will never provide modernized aircraft. We will never, go down the list of, we will never do X, Y, and Z. And the answer that Biden gave on several occasions was, well, that could mean World War III, and we don't want that. All of those lines, not lines defined by the Russians, but lines defined by the Biden administration, have been crossed. We're the ones that have crossed lines that we set up for ourselves. The Russians have simply told us again and again, the more intrusive you become in Ukraine, the more involved you get, the greater the likelihood that you will end up in a war with us. That's Moscow's message. Remember, there was the great Petraeus concept of let's put together non-NATO and NATO forces in Eastern Europe, and we'll have this crusade at least into part of Western Ukraine and set up a safe zone. Well, that went away quickly because the Europeans said, you've lost your mind. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen now. We're not going to commit any ground forces. And if we tried to, we'd run out of gas after 40, 50, 60 miles. We're not prepared for it. We aren't trained for it. And we're not properly equipped for it. We don't have the integrated air and missile defense. Forget it. The Russians know these things. They know our weaknesses and they know our strengths. And that's why I bring us back to the nuclear question. Everything that Keane says is irrelevant. It can't be done. It's not going to happen. It doesn't matter what we provide. If we provide anything short of nuclear weapons, the Russians will defeat those things. And then they will press ahead. And I think that's what we're going to see now. From the very beginning, Putin was never interested in conquering Ukraine. That's a myth. That's a lie. He was interested in liberating the Russians in eastern Ukraine who were being oppressed by the Ukrainian government. That's what he was interested in doing. And he wasn't even going to stay in those regions until it was made clear to him by the population, well, if you come in here and you improve things and fix things for us, as soon as you leave, the Ukrainian secret police will show up and shoot us all through the head. You can't leave. You need to stay. Okay, he made the decision. Fine, we'll stay. Those areas are historically Russian anyway. And at each point in time, he has held back in the search for negotiations. The big news that no one in Washington seems to get is that there's no longer any willingness to negotiate with us. That's over. It's done. This war will be settled on terms that suit Moscow. Whatever we want, whatever we think is irrelevant. And in that connection, he's made it clear, since you have no strategy, you have no coherent approach to anything, no willingness to negotiate, it was never there, then don't think that you can fall back on the nuclear threat. Because if you do, you are consigning yourselves and your country to destruction. We will not sit idly by and let you do that.
Yeah, and it's so Keane was the military voice that's saying a lot of this stuff, and there's a couple of others.
I think it's an exaggeration to call that a military voice. I mean,
okay, well, he did serve.
He's the equivalent of a political officer in the old Soviet military system.
Fair enough.
He's thoroughly politicized. He has an ideological position. He's going to push that and defend it because the people that hatched these dumb ideas have made him rich. It's no accident. So let's be honest. I wish that whenever people like General Keane come on television, they would list under it, what are his sources of income? Who's paying him? And just you follow the rabbit down the hole and you will discover all sorts of very interesting things. We don't do that. And so people say, oh, well, he's a general. He must know something. Yeah,
they say that. I know when he's on Fox, they always say the Fox News strategic analyst, but they don't say anything about his direct ties to the military arms industry. But anyway,
I can't even begin to recall all of the command post exercises that I participated in during my many decades, my 28 years of service, where at some point the division, the corps, the Army headquarters in this old World War II paradigm was suddenly found by the enemy and destroyed. And everybody at lower levels looked at each other and said, well, now we have a chance to win the war. The faith that the American Republic continues to have in these senior officers is unjustified. It needs to go away. Just go back and recall what you've seen over the last 20 years. Look at all the broken promises, all the claims of success. How many times do we have to go back, Dan, and talk about we have built this Iraqi army? It is resolute, it's trained, it's disciplined, and they're ready to go. We have a new state. We're a big success. And we saw how well that went when pathetic ISIS attacked in pickup trucks. So we need, this crap needs to go away. We need to stop listening to these people. But the mainstream pays them well. The mainstream is part of the problem. They're signed on ideologically for these conflicts and wars, not just in Ukraine, but also the war of destruction in the Middle East.
Well, indeed, the mainstream media is, as now this representative here of a guy named Hall from Fox News, who's talking about the next wonder weapon that is actually going to change the war. Watch this.
One thing that the Ukrainians have been asking for since the beginning of this war is the ability to strike out at Russia and to hit those air bases, those military depots, all of those military sites 200 to 400 miles inside Russia. That would absolutely change the war, change Russia's ability to attack. The US, the UK have been unwilling to give them these ballistic missiles. And so hearing today that the Ukrainians have developed their own missiles could well change what we see in the coming days and weeks. Because if the Ukrainians can by themselves hit these depots, they can drastically reduce Russia's ability to continue their attack and to supply their own troops.
So what do you say to that one? I mean, I think you've pretty much already covered it, but
Well, I think it's important to point out that we have this obsession. It's not unique to us. This has happened to many peoples over time, of attaching a lot of significance to the arrival of some new wonder weapon. The wonder weapon, when it arrives, never turns out to be quite what we expected or to do what we would have liked it to do. The only one that turned out to be real was, of course, the atomic bomb. And that was so horrific that most sane people in the world concluded that's the end of this nonsense. We're not going to fight wars like this anymore. And indeed, we have not fought wars on the scale of World War II since then, and we probably won't in the future. So we've always had the wrong structure with the wrong equipment for the wrong reasons. That needs to change. That's another subject that's worth exploring. But right now, I think what he's saying is he's trying to give hope to people that the arrival of some new missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, whatever they turn out to be, are going to find just those key targets. Because remember, that's the Air Force obsession. Oh, if we can just put the right targets together, we know we can win. We don't need the Army or the Air or the Navy. We can do this on our own. We can win this with our bombers. All of this stuff, we've been down this road before. When it comes to high-end conventional warfare, frankly, there is no easy solution. There's no easy formula. And I think Alex, who's written brilliant stuff for the Royal United Institute of Military Studies and so Strategic Studies, his articles point to the realities. We still have to deal with constraints on ammo. We still have to deal with constraints on mobility. We still have to deal with weather. And we have to be able to rapidly replenish ourselves. Right now, we've got at least 3 carrier battle groups and a lot of other ships floating around the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. And you can't keep them out there indefinitely. They've got to go back to a harbor, or they have to have replenishment ships go to the harbor and bring out food, bring out water. And if they start shooting large quantities of rockets and missiles, which inevitably they will, those things have to be replenished. They've got to rearm and requip. You know, you've been down this. You know exactly what I'm talking about. This gentleman that was just on comes across like a teenager who's been playing too many computer games and really believes this hopium. It's nonsense. It needs to go away. This is
right. You know, and it's, I think a lot of the reason for that, Doug, is because of men like Jack Keane that he sees that come on his network all the time, and David Petraeus, Kellogg, all these other guys on CNN as well, is that he hears those and they think, well, they must know what they're talking about. But I want to now kind of shift gears a little bit. So that's been what's been talked about up at the up in the ethereal level, whatever. But let's look at what's actually happening on the ground. We looked a little bit at the Kursk salient itself, and you see it's just a little bulge in there that can't go anywhere else. It's been stuck since at least the 16th of this month, and it's not going to go anywhere else. It's going to shrink down. But the biggest cost of that, at least operationally, is in the east. And I'm going to show you some specific things about a couple of the different areas which are starting to really accelerate in their losses. But before I get to that, I want to show you something that was on Alex of History Legends today. He has a new video out there, and there was a couple of things he said in there about armor and about drones that is not anywhere in the mainstream media, and is part of the reason you're seeing this big shift in the east. Watch this.
According to various sources, the armed forces of Ukraine only have 400 operational Western APCs left, so it's simply impossible to carry out large mechanized counterattacks. And now they're down to 399. With the full tactical initiative in their hands, the Russians could attempt bolder and riskier moves without fearing a serious slap in the face. You remember how last year Ukraine decided to compensate its lack of artillery with drones. At first, this strategy seemed very successful, as it was low cost, high reward. But with time, this advantage seems to have faded away. Apparently, in this article by Bild, we learned that the share of successful operations of attack drones is now about 10%. A year ago, it was 40%. One Ukrainian soldier also explained how the Russian armed forces are becoming better and better at using jammers that create radio interference. This makes it increasingly difficult to operate kamikaze drones, because before striking enemy units, you have to look for gaps in the Russian radio frequency suppression system. This means that fewer and fewer drones reach their targets.
So, the drones were a big issue at the beginning, but because of the Russia's advances in electronic warfare, now then, at least according to these reports that he's citing, 10% are successful. And I've seen that in some of the footage you'll see indirectly, because you'll see that the Russians are able to move with a lot more freedom without having to worry about either armor or drones coming in from the sky.
All he's doing, Dan, is telling us something that we all know. For every measure on the battlefield, there is inevitably a countermeasure. The utility of surprise, tactical surprise, with the use of new weapons or even operational surprise is limited. It has a very short half-life. Eventually, everybody becomes accustomed to it. At the end of World War I, you had lots of senior American and British officers who were disappointed in the performance of tanks, because the Germans rapidly adjusted and adapted and figured out how to stop tank attacks. Gosh, I wonder how that happened. This is inevitable. They didn't understand that any particular weapon has to fit in within a larger framework where you can compensate for the deficiencies in one platform with the capabilities of another. This has been true. Today, it's more true than ever because of the criticality of achieving persistent ISR over the battlefield, plus dominance in the air to prevent your own forces from being lost before they ever reach the battlefield. And that's what's been happening to the Ukrainians now. They're not getting anywhere because as soon as they stick their heads up, something from above shoots them down.
So the rest of Alex's video today was specifically on the area of Toretsk on the east, and he was showing how the Toretsk and then a couple of other areas are kind of hinging the whole center in there, and that's starting to fall. Russia's moving right up into the Toretsk area as well. And then now I want to shift up to this is what Weeb Union was talking about in terms of the speed of the accelerating direction of how fast Russia's advancing now. Watch this one.
So we look at Konstantinivka, and the Russians have apparently captured the rest of the town. We see the Russians from gaining a foothold to reaching the central parts of the town. It took about a month, potentially more, since it was last month they first got a foothold within the town. We take a look at how long it took to capture Novomikhailivka. It took way too long. And then suddenly they capture the rest of the town in a single day. That is quite the WTF moment.
And that's happening along the front in a bunch of areas, especially in the Pokrovsk area, on the flanks especially. And as we see in this one last Weeb Union here, there's another whole section that's at risk of falling possibly within days.
So we see that the Russians would have two targets following the capture of Ukrainsk and Selidove, which would be the train station here along the railways, further down south to Novoselivka, the fortified positions, and then down to Ilyinka. This will allow the Russians to have the front line from the north, Mikhailivka, Selidove, Ukrainsk, and all the way down south to the Vovcha River north of Kurakhove, which would completely cut off the village agglomeration to the east. So we see that if the Russians continue pushing as they have been along the fortified positions, the front line here north of Kurakhove all the way to Selidove could completely collapse this entire area here.
That area he's talking about there, there was somewhere around 3,000 Ukrainian folks in there. And what's beneath the move here is not just that they're running out of armor and that their drones are becoming less and less effective, but because of all this that was going up in the north with the Kursk area, that drew away a lot of the best trained troops that they had, and they actually withdrew some from these areas. So the guys on the ground there, the Ukrainians, are actually complaining that, number one, that they keep getting, and you can speak to the importance of this, they take a lot of units like brigades, and they take this company and move it here. They take that company and move it there. So they lose their unit cohesion, and then they just don't have enough. So there is a big dearth of capabilities in the entire front line on the east, which could potentially, really for the first time in the 2 years of this war, in the last 2 years, collapse.
Well, I think that's true. And, the war, truthfully, I think was lost by Ukraine at least 18 months ago, maybe longer. And the Russians, as I pointed out earlier, have exercised great restraint, and they have declined to attack aggressively to the west because that's not their interest. It's not what they want. However, I'd point something out now, and I'm sure this is under discussion in the highest levels right now of the Russian military establishment with President Putin. You can continue to make these advances. You can make the Ukrainian defense impossible. I think it's already pretty clear that whatever the Ukrainians do, it's not going to make much difference. But if you want to end this war in any sort of way that conforms to Russian national security interests, if there was ever a time in the course of this war for the Russians to strike decisively to the west, and I'm talking about in direction of the Dnieper River and Kiev, this is it. Because quite frankly, it would be a mistake to assume that continuing these operations is going to give the Russians what they want, which is an end to the war. And I know they want an end to it. I know the Russian people want an end to it. And the good news for President Putin is that his population is willing to do whatever is required to end that war. I think he and his generals are going to have to make a decision, but I don't see how you avoid what I just described. As long as this poisonous criminal regime in Kiev survives, and they are corrupt on a scale that would shame anyone in organized crime anywhere in the world. As long as this continues, they will be a permanent menace to Moscow and the Russian people. The regime itself has to go. All of the Ukrainians that live west of the river are not the enemy. They may not like Russians, but they're not the problem. The problem is in Kiev, and that has to be taken on and solved in the most decisive manner possible. Once that's done, everything else is likely to fall into place.
Now, let me ask. So some people who push back against that argument, they say, oh, well, in fact, a perfect example. We had a clip on General Hodges a couple of days ago to where he looked at his map and he says, okay, look how long it took Russia to go from Avdiivka up to the current front line in the Pokrovsk area. It was about 50 kilometers, and it took them about 6 months to go. So he's just kind of drawing a linear line forward, saying, so it might take them another 6 months to go another 50 kilometers, and maybe they can stiffen their resolve, et cetera. So they're still thinking things of a linear term here. But when people hear, ideas like this, whether coming out of Russia or your military analysis, that maybe they're going to take the city of Odessa or the city of Kharkiv or even Kiev, how physically could Russia do that when they seem to have not gone very far, very fast up to this point?
Well, remember that conditions 2.5 years ago were very different than what you've got today. 2.5 years ago, Russia had a remarkably small army. It was not prepared for a major war. It didn't want a major war. All of the assumptions that underpinned the special military operation were divorced, frankly, from reality in the West, because I think President Putin truly believed that he was dealing with people in the West who ultimately wanted to get along with him, who wanted a relationship with Russia and could be negotiated with. Well, it took time, but he was finally persuaded that that's not the case. Today, Russia has a massive force. What happens down in this area is not terribly important, to be blunt. It's not going to change a whole lot. The Ukrainians are already on the ropes. And I think the Russians know that. The Russians also now have the logistical support structure and the buildup of missiles, artillery ammunition, rockets, everything that they need to support this. So this would be an ideal opportunity, in my judgment, to launch this decisive operation designed to end the war. Now, they may choose not to do that. They have been, as I think you and I both realize, and many others, very deliberate, very cautious. But they have more trained troops now. They have more trained and qualified officers now. They have a better general staff than they had at the beginning. In other words, the ingredients are there for decisive operations. And I think that's why I'm betting that you'll see something like that before long. The alternative is that you back off and you wait again. And it may not make much difference because we're in our own particular abyss, if you will. We've got problems with our financial system. The economy doesn't work very well anymore. We have a lot of unhappy people here in the United States. The armed forces are stretched very thin. Nobody is interested in joining them, or very few people are. So you could make an argument if you wanted to, that if the Russians simply wait long enough, things will fall apart on their own and they won't have to fight very hard for it. But I think there's pressure now that did not exist before. I think the Russians know they have the upper hand. And I think there's a great deal of pressure to use that upper hand decisively.
And what would be your assessment of the, I guess, the first big hammer blow? So basically, kind of what would we watch for? If they decide to make a move like this, would it be towards Odessa first, Kharkiv, Kiev? What would you see as the first major target?
Well, I think you've already seen evidence for it with this latest strike on the power grid and energy grid in Ukraine. That was devastating. There were more missiles and precision munitions and drones used in that strike just a couple of days ago than I think we've ever seen. So I would say that you're going to see more of that. And again, you're sure you can go down to Odessa, you can go to Kharkov. Will that end anything? As long as Z-Man sits pretty in Kiev and continues to dole out nonsense without interruption and helps prop up the illusion that there is a legitimate government in Kiev. I mean, this is the man that sabotaged elections. This is the man that has essentially taken on the Ukrainian Orthodox and Russian Orthodox churches. If anything, he's closer to a Bolshevik revolutionary than he is to anybody that normally would come to power. And we forget that we had elections during the Civil War. We reelected Lincoln. We had elections during World War II. We reelected FDR. So this can be done if you are dealing with a real state, a legitimate state. This thing in Ukraine is not. It's propped up by the arrival of these weapons that, frankly, are not going to make any difference to the outcome. None of these new weapons, 15, 12 F-16s, who are we kidding? They don't have enough artillery ammunition, so now we're going to give them or help them with a ballistic missile from Great Britain or somewhere. It's absurd. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to alter the outcome of the war. It's sort of like the V rockets that were fired at England at the end of, during 1944. They made a splash. It didn't make any difference. Yeah. That's what we're dealing with now. So again, the Russian general staff has not put me on distribution, so I can't tell you what they're going to do.
Right.
I'm simply saying that the conditions today are radically different from the conditions that were described by General Hodges. This is a very different force now. Russia is a different population. Russian society is more cohesive than ever. Anybody who thinks that the use of any of these weapons against the Russian population is going to have a positive impact on removing someone like Putin, they're crazy. If anything, this kind of thing will draw the government and the population closer.
Right.
That's what's happening in Russia.
Yeah, it's definitely. In the last few minutes we have, I want to ask what may be the most important question of this whole show here, and that is kind of at the 30,000 foot level in terms of geopolitically, what the ramifications of this could be. So we just had, just days ago, Xi Jinping announced that he was personally going to go to the Kazan meeting of the BRICS in Russia in late October. And with all of that's going on there, with the expansion of this emerging economic bloc, the competitor to the G7 and all that has been really existed since World War II, it seems like the stage has been set for others in the world to start moving in their direction and leaving our orbit here too. And especially if what you say turns out to be the case, and it seems like it's inevitable, whether it's going to be sometime in the next few months or even if God forbid, another year and a half or so of war, even if it dragged on that long, eventually it's going to come down to that. It almost can't go any other way. That will mean that everything the West did, all of NATO, all these 50 nations we brag about all the time, utterly failed and lost. And then Russia is now the military threat conventionally on the continent, assuming it doesn't go nuclear. And then you have this large economic bloc that's starting to be a big competitor to the West. How do you see the geostrategic ramifications of this war shaken out?
Well, I think you've described the inevitable outcome, that the world is siding with BRICS. There's no question about it. And this is because the world in general is tired of being bullied by us. We've bullied the world with financial power. We've bullied the world with military power. We've bullied the world with economic strength. People are tired of it. They don't want to be told what to grow. They don't want to be told how to govern themselves. They don't want to be told what the preconditions are for a loan from the World Bank based on what we determine is appropriate or inappropriate. They want to live as free, independent, sovereign states. Russia, certainly President Putin and President Xi have both sent a clear message. Join us. There are no preconditions. You want to trade freely. You want to improve your standard of living. You want greater prosperity. You want peace and stability. We all support that. Join us. We forget that in the aftermath of World War II, with this menace that emanated from the Soviet Union of communism, and to a lesser extent, but it was still there, from China, the world turned to us as a safe haven and wanted our support and help and assistance. Yeah. All of that should have remained untarnished, if you will, at the end of the Cold War, had we simply said, we've been in all of these places long enough. We now respect everybody's right to rule themselves as they see fit. We respect your culture, your way of life, and we're not going to try to impose anything on you. We want to get along with everybody. We could have done that. We sabotaged all that by suddenly declaring vast tracts of the world the enemy, and anybody who didn't want to do what we wanted as the enemy. Remember, that was George Bush in 2001. You're either with us or you're against us. Yeah. The truth is that in most cases, most of the world is neutral. Doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
And then we're not satisfied to have, support in a particular setting like the UN or somewhere else. We want tributary states. And they're sick of it. We see ourselves as the center of the universe. We aren't. It's over. You just described the alternative. So how does this war end? It ends on terms that will be determined primarily by Moscow. But Moscow is not as stupid as we are. And when Moscow finally brings this to a close, I'm sure they will turn to all of the states that border Ukraine and ask them to sign up for whatever solution they determine is appropriate. And that solution could be radically different from what you see today on the map. And if it turns out that way, it's not the first time in that region of the world that places have been carved up and handed over to other powers. Everybody forgets the Poles were partitioned in the 1790s, not because people hated the Poles, not because the Poles had gold bullion stored to the nth degree, because the place was a catalyst for conflict. The Poles failed to govern themselves effectively. And the heads of Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary looked at this and said, if we don't move in there, carve this place up and control it, it'll be a problem in perpetuity. We'll end up at war with each other. And they didn't want to go to war. I don't think anybody in Eastern Europe wants to go to war with Russia, and vice versa. So I think it'll work itself out that way. We are probably going to be marginalized, if not outright kicked out and expelled.
Well, yeah, that's actually my last question here. I fear that there is a risk of us getting really stupid. If it looks like that the realities on the battlefield start to make that, and the geopolitical realities and economics start to go in that direction, that instead of us acknowledging that we lost and that we've made huge mistakes and now we're going to have to deal with the wreckage, that we might do something stupid and escalate the situation to try to avoid that. Do you think we can avoid that outcome?
Well, Albert Einstein shares your viewpoint. He said, what's the difference between genius and stupidity? Genius has its limits. And so it's eminently possible that we make things worse. Right now, we have a 4-star admiral in the Navy who is advocating the escort of Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. Well, first of all, have the Filipinos, the government, the people there asked for this? I have not seen any evidence for that. In fact, I've seen the evidence for the opposite. Now, maybe he's talking to some counterpart in the Philippine Navy that graduated from Annapolis with him. You know, we have a lot of that going on. And maybe that he's saying, well, that's what you should say because that's what we really want. But I don't see any evidence for that in the Philippines. I think that government now wants to work out its differences with China on its own. The Vietnamese, who have far greater differences with the Chinese over the South China Sea, frankly, in many ways, they're working it out with the Chinese. We have to learn to let the people in the various regions of the world work these things out on their own. What this admiral is suggesting, I don't believe, is very sensible. You know, resorting to an escort service for small powers ostensibly against China doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Nope. It doesn't, but that's the state of play that we have today. But we'll leave it right there. Doug, thanks ever so much for coming on. Like always, this terrific viewpoint here and really laying out in stark terms what's at stake here and what we have to face. Anything new going on in Our Country, Our Choice before we let you go today?
Yeah, next week we're going to come out with this. It's not really Our Country, Our Choice. It's called One Truth Media, which is a parent company. They're going to come out with a new platform called Republic, RE:public. It's a free speech platform. It's the easiest and simplest way to describe it. And you're going to be charged to get on it. One fee, one time for a year, and there will be people out there that will have discount codes you'll be able to get it for less. But I think once people see it, they go onto it because anybody can go on the platform for free. They just can't use the tools. They can't take the actions that the platform allows you to take, which involves everything from telling everybody in your county what you think they ought to be doing, or informing them of things that happen to you, to effectively telling your congressman or state senator you're sick to death of them and would like to see an end to the policies that they're pursuing, whatever. But the point is, I think it's going to be a revolution in ways, because the idea is that this cannot be canceled. And we're not taking any money from people who want to advertise. We won't do it because we don't want to be hostage to the oligarchs, to the big corporations. We don't like what you said, or somebody came on the platform and said something. You can go on and say whatever you want. Now, we don't want people to be vulgar, and we're not interested in pornography, and we're not going to tolerate people to come on there and spend every day telling us why they think the United States should be destroyed. So as long as you're not writing stupidity like that, you're welcome. Doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. That's that. And if you're a small business with 500 employees or less, you can come on this platform, set up your own space and advertise. You pay the one-time fee like anybody else. But small business, small farmers, people like that, they're not getting anything from us, and we're not taking anything from them. They're a user like everybody else who pays the fee to get on there. I think this will work. And this is just the beginning. There will be, over the next several weeks, new items, new capabilities that arrive on this platform. We're going to make it better and better and better and more effective over time. So I think it makes a lot of sense right now for as many people as possible to sign up and join it. And you're familiar with this, and I think you'll be one of those out there that'll be telling people about it. And I think you'll be able to offer people discounts. I hope so. So at any rate, I certainly will, because this is desperately needed. Free speech is everything. And as I tell everybody, the Second Amendment is equally important, because without it, you don't get the first one. Right?
Yeah. And we've seen what free speech is doing right now, with Telegram and some of these other things going on in France. So it's a no kidding big deal. So we look forward to telling people about this, and we will definitely do everything we can to make people aware of it. So thanks for coming on today. Again, as always, appreciate you guys watching us as always. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already done that, and pass this along to anybody else you see, because folks, we are unintimidated and uncompromised in bringing you the truth, especially on issues like this that have to do with your future. Thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.